James lived on a small space station, far away from the bustling cities of Earth. The station floated in the quiet of deep space, a place where humans had set up shop to repair ships, trade, and explore the galaxy. Most people who worked on the station were skilled engineers, mechanics, or scientists. But James, though skilled, had always felt like an ordinary man. He was just a mechanic, fixing broken ships and machines, earning a modest living in a quiet corner of the galaxy. Every day. He worked in the repair bay, surrounded by pieces of broken machinery and tools. The sound of welding torches and buzzing drills was the music of his life. It was a peaceful existence, but James often thought about the larger world. He had heard stories about the great civilizations in the galaxy, advanced alien species that could create starships the size of cities, manipulate energy fields with a thought, and bend the laws of physics to their will. Humans, on the other hand, were still trying to catch up. They were strong, but not nearly as powerful as the other species. In a galaxy full of extraordinary beings, humans were often seen as weak and unimportant. One day, the space station's docking bay buzzed with excitement. A special ship had arrived. It was a massive vessel, far larger and more advanced than any other ship that had ever visited the station. The crew was tense, whispering to one another as they watched the ship land. James had been fixing a damaged engine when the captain of the station called for him to help with a special task. "James," the captain said, "I need you to come with me. We've got a very important visitor today." James followed the captain through the corridors of the station, his boots echoing against the metal floors. As they entered the grand hall, he saw the visitor. It was Princess Zara, the heir to one of the most powerful kingdoms in the galaxy. She was known for her beauty, her strength, and her leadership. She had the grace of a queen and the power of a warrior. Her presence commanded respect, and all who saw her immediately fell silent. She was not just any alien. She was royalty. James had seen her image on news broadcasts and holo recordings, but seeing her in person was different. She stood tall, her eyes sharp and focused, scanning the room with confidence. To most, she was nothing less than magnificent. But to James, she was just another person, another alien from a far-off world. The captain introduced James, but it was clear Princess Zara wasn't interested in him. She looked at him for only a moment, then turned her attention to the other engineers and officials. James wasn't offended. He knew how it worked. She was important, and he was just a mechanic. He watched as she walked through the station, surrounded by her guards, giving orders and making decisions with the ease of a born leader. Still, James couldn't help but feel a strange sense of curiosity his work, fixing engines and keeping the station running. He didn't expect any more attention from Zara, nor did he want any. She was too important for someone like him to notice. But then something changed. It wasn't anything huge, just a small moment that caught his attention. Princess Zara had been talking to a group of officials when a strange noise echoed through the station. The lights flickered for a second, and the ground shook slightly beneath their feet. A low rumble echoed from the docking bay. James immediately stood up, his mechanic instincts kicking in. Something was wrong with the station's power grid. Without thinking, he ran toward the source of the problem. The others were too busy with their discussions to notice. But Zara's sharp eyes followed James as he moved quickly through the station. He found the source of the problem in the power control room. A malfunctioning circuit was sparking, threatening to cause a major power failure. James rushed to the panel, his hands steady as he worked. He disconnected the faulty components and replaced them with spare parts from his toolkit. The lights stabilized, and the rumbling stopped. As he finished, Princess Zara appeared in the doorway, her eyes fixed on him. For the first time since meeting her, James felt a sense of importance. She wasn't looking at him like a simple mechanic anymore. She was watching him with a new interest. "Well done," she said, her voice smooth and calm. Not many would have reacted so quickly. James looked up, surprised by the praise. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone praised by someone like her. He simply nodded, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just a mechanic," he said, trying to brush off the moment. "It's what I do." Zara studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure him out. Then, without another word, she turned and left. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time, he felt like maybe he wasn't just an ordinary man. The days following the small power failure were filled with unease. James continued his work on the station, but the sense of peace that once filled the place was now replaced by tension. News spread quickly that a new threat had emerged in the galaxy: the Void Collective. The Collective was a ruthless group of aliens that had been sweeping through star systems, leaving destruction in their wake. Entire civilizations had been wiped out with no mercy, and the Galactic Council was scrambling to figure out how to stop them. James could feel the fear in the air. It was like the entire station had become aware of its fragility. Humans, once seen as weak and unimportant, were now in the spotlight. Their world had always been small in comparison to the massive powers of the galaxy, but now it was under threat, just like everyone else. Princess Zara's visit to the station became even more significant. Her kingdom, the Solaris Empire, had always been a stronghold in the galaxy, but even they were not prepared for the might of the Void Collective. Zara had been sent to meet with the council to discuss the threat and plan a strategy for her people's survival. On the third day after the power failure, an emergency meeting was called. The captain of the station gathered all the crew, including James, to discuss the situation. James wasn't usually part of such important meetings, but the captain had insisted that everyone in the station's maintenance team attend. As he walked into the meeting room, James could feel the nervous energy around him. The room was filled with officers, scientists, and engineers. Princess Zara stood at the front, her regal figure towering over the crowd. Despite the worry in the room, she remained composed, her sharp eyes focused on the task at hand. "We have received word that the Void Collective is approaching," she said, her voice steady, despite the obvious danger. "They have already destroyed 3 of the outer colonies. We cannot afford to underestimate them." James listened quietly, trying to take in every word. He wasn't a soldier. The captain of the station spoke next. "We've fortified the station as much as we can. Our weapons are ready, and we've contacted the nearest fleet for backup. But it might not be enough. We'll need to figure out how they would survive the coming storm." James kept to the back of the room, staying out of the way, but his mind was racing. The thought of the Void Collective coming for them filled him with dread. He had never been in a battle before. He didn't know how to fight. All he had ever done was fix things. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something needed to be done. This wasn't just a fight for the station or even for Zara's kingdom. This was a fight for all of humanity. If they didn't do something, the galaxy would fall into the hands of the Void Collective. That night, as he walked back to his quarters, James couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. The station had been his world for so long, and now it was facing a danger it wasn't prepared for. He had never been a fighter. He wasn't trained for war. But as the words of the captain echoed in his mind, something stirred within him. He wasn't just going to sit back and watch everything fall apart. There had to be a way he could help. The next morning, James made his way to the weapons bay. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, but he couldn't stop himself. He had seen the soldiers training, practicing with blasters and energy weapons. It looked complicated, but he knew that if he was going to help, he needed to learn how to defend himself. Inside the weapons bay, the atmosphere was tense. Soldiers were busy, preparing for the inevitable conflict, but they took no notice of James as he approached the training area. There, behind a series of locked cabinets, were weapons designed for combat. He had always thought of them as dangerous and unnecessary, but now they were the only chance of survival. He needed one. James walked up to a training officer and asked, "How do I get one of these?" The officer looked him up and down, surprised. "You? You're just a mechanic. These weapons are for soldiers." James met the officer's gaze without hesitation. "I'm not just a mechanic anymore. I need to learn. Now." The officer studied him for a moment, clearly unsure of what to make of this ordinary human asking for a weapon. After a pause, he finally nodded. "All right, but don't expect this to be easy. We're facing something we've never seen before. You'll need to be quick. You'll need to be strong." James nodded. He was ready. James woke early the next morning, his mind racing with thoughts of the Void Collective and the weapon he now felt he needed to master. He had never been trained for combat, but the urgency of the situation made him push past any doubts. The galaxy was on the brink of a war, and if they couldn't stand against the Void Collective, there might not be a galaxy left. His hands still shook a little as he entered the weapons training room. The officer who had given him permission to train was already there, waiting. The officer raised an eyebrow when he saw James. "Back again, huh? Thought you'd have second thoughts by now." James squared his shoulders. "I'm not going to sit around and wait for something to happen. I want to help." The officer gave a short nod, clearly impressed. "All right, let's see what you've got." James stood in front of the officer, trying to ignore the feeling of being out of place. Soldiers around him were practicing with ease, moving fluidly as they fired their weapons. But James wasn't them. He was just again, the officer said, not unkindly. "But this time, steady your hands. Focus. You're not repairing a ship now." James took a deep breath and steadied himself. He reminded himself that this wasn't just about him. It was about survival. He aimed once more, his hands gripping the weapon tighter, and fired again. The shot was better this time, but it still missed. "You're getting there," the officer said. "But you need to think like a soldier, not like a mechanic." James nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood what that meant. How could someone like him think like a soldier? He was just a regular person, a simple mechanic who fixed things, but the officer's words stuck with him. Think like a soldier. He spent the next few hours practicing. At first, every shot missed. He adjusted his stance, focused on his breathing, and tried to steady his aim. Slowly, he started hitting the edges of the target. Then, little by little, his shots began to land closer to the center. It was hard work, and his arms grew tired, but James didn't give up. He had to keep going. He couldn't afford to fail. Not now. The stakes were too high. By the end of the day, James had improved. His aim was better, and he had begun to get a feel for how the blaster worked in his hands. He knew it wasn't enough, but it was a start. He would continue training, even when it felt impossible. The Void Collective wasn't waiting for anyone to catch up. They would strike when the time was right. As he left the training room, drenched in sweat and exhausted, he couldn't help but think about the others, the soldiers and the warriors who had trained their whole lives to fight. What would they think of him? A mechanic who had never held a weapon before, trying to fight alongside them. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew he couldn't go back now. The next few days were a blur of practice, strategy meetings, and preparing for the worst. The station buzzed with activity. There was no time to rest. The Void Collective was getting closer, and they had to be ready. James worked harder than ever, practicing with the blaster every chance he got. He even began to learn hand-to-hand combat techniques, something he never thought he would need. The officers and soldiers taught him what they could, and James absorbed every lesson. During one of the strategy meetings, Princess Zara made another appearance. She stood at the head of the room, her presence commanding attention. She spoke of the importance of unity, of fighting together, and of defending their homes no matter the cost. James listened carefully. Zara's words stirred something deep inside him. She wasn't just leading her people, she was leading all of them, humans, aliens, and everyone in between. She saw them as equals in this fight. And for the first time, James began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as ordinary as he had once thought. The Void Collective didn't care who was ordinary or extraordinary, they only cared about one thing: destroying everything in their path. James knew the galaxy wouldn't be saved by technology alone. It would be saved by the courage of those who were willing to fight, even when it seemed impossible. Later that evening, as James walked through the corridors of the station, he saw Zara again. She was standing by a large window, looking out at the stars. Her expression was serious, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. James hesitated for a moment, then walked up to her. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew he had to speak. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly. Zara turned her head, meeting his eyes. For a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. She didn't need to say anything. James had already made up his mind. He was ready to fight, not just for himself, but for everyone who depended on this station, this galaxy, and the people he was starting to care about. "I know," she said, her voice low and steady, "and I'm glad you're with us." The station was a hive of activity as the threat of the Void Collective loomed closer. The once quiet hum of everyday life had turned into a constant buzz of tension and worry. James had never seen the station so alive with urgency. Every soldier, every officer, and every mechanic had a job to do. Everyone was working together, each person trying to prepare for a fight that none of them were truly ready for. James had become part of that effort. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. His daily routine had changed completely. His hands, once skilled at fixing engines and machines, now moved with a blaster in hand, aiming at targets and practicing his shot. He had never imagined that he would be learning how to fight. But the days of peace had long since passed. This was war, and it was coming whether they were ready or not. He trained every chance he got, his body growing sore from the constant drills. It wasn't easy, but he was determined. He couldn't let his fear stop him. He had seen how the Void Collective had wiped out entire planet. "You're improving," she said finally, her voice cool and measured. James wasn't sure how to respond. He had never been good at taking compliments, especially from someone as important as Princess Zara. He simply nodded. "I'm trying. The Void Collective won't wait for us to get ready." Zara's eyes softened slightly as she studied him. There was something in her gaze that James hadn't seen before. Respect, maybe, or perhaps understanding. It wasn't just about the blaster in his hands or the hours he had spent training. It was something deeper, something she hadn't expected. From a human. "You're more than just a mechanic, aren't you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. James glanced down at the weapon in his hand, unsure of how to answer. He had always thought of himself as just a simple man, someone who fixed things and stayed out of the way. But as the days went on, he had started to realize that he was more than that. He wasn't just fixing ships anymore, he was preparing for a fight. He was ready to protect his home, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to help save the galaxy. "I've had to be more than that," he said. "There's no choice now. The Void Collective, they'll destroy everything if we don't fight back." Zara's expression hardened. "You're right. And yet, most humans still don't understand the stakes. They don't understand what's at risk. But you seem to get it." James shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just doing what I can. I've never been a soldier. I don't know if I'm enough." Zara stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "None of us are enough on our own, but together we might have a chance." James looked at her, seeing the weight of responsibility in her eyes. Princess Zara wasn't just the heir to a powerful empire, she was a leader, and her people were looking to her for strength. In that moment, James realized that her strength wasn't just in her royal blood or her ability to command armies. It was in her willingness to stand up when the world seemed to be crumbling around her. "You may not have trained for this," Zara continued, "but your willingness to fight for what you believe in, that's what matters. That's what makes you more than ordinary." James swallowed hard. He wasn't used to hearing such praise, especially from someone like Zara. But her words felt different. They weren't just empty compliments. She truly saw him, not just as a mechanic, but as someone who had stepped up when it mattered. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I won't let you down." Zara nodded. "You've already proven that you won't. You've already done more than many ever will. You're part of this fight now, James. You're part of something bigger than yourself." He looked at her then, truly seeing her for the first time. Zara wasn't just a princess or a leader. She was a person, someone who was just as scared and uncertain as everyone else, but who chose to stand up anyway. That's what made her different. That's what made her a leader. As they stood there, a sense of calm washed over James. There was still a war to fight, and the Void Collective was still out there. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He wasn't just a mechanic or an ordinary man. He was part of something much bigger, and that made all the difference. The days stretched into weeks as the threat of the Void Collective grew closer. The space station had become a fortress, its once quiet halls now filled with soldiers, engineers, and civilians, all preparing for an enemy they knew little about. James continued his training, every muscle in his body aching from the constant drills. His hands had become familiar with the weight of the blaster, and his aim had improved, though he still didn't consider himself a soldier. He wasn't one of the elite fighters or seasoned warriors. But what he lacked in experience, he made up for in determination. Princess Zara's visits became more frequent as the war approached. She had become a symbol of hope for the station and the people who called it home. The Void Collective was coming, and their destruction would be swift. Zara, with her strength and grace, led with confidence, but James could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was a leader, but even leaders had their limits. Even they could feel the weight of what was coming. One evening, as James was finishing his last training session of the day, he was called to the main command center. The captain of the station had requested his presence, and although James wasn't sure why, he obeyed the call without hesitation. When he arrived, he found Zara standing alongside the captain, her expression serious. "James," the captain said, nodding toward the monitor in front of him. "We've received word that the Void Collective is moving faster than expected. They're on their way, and we need to make a decision. Do we hold the station or do we evacuate?" James felt his heart skip a beat. The decision wasn't one he was prepared to make, and yet it was the kind of decision that could mean the difference between life and death. Zara was silent for a moment, staring at the data on the screen. "We don't have much time," Zara finally said, her voice steady but full of resolve. "If we leave, the Void Collective will overtake us before we can reach a safe location. If we stay, we risk everything. But we can fight. We have to fight." James watched as she turned to face the group, her gaze sweeping over the room. Her presence filled the space, commanding the attention of everyone there. He could see it. She wasn't just trying to protect her people. She was protecting everyone, even those who had once thought humans were too weak to survive. "I'll fight," James said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but there was no hesitation. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He had become something more. "I'll fight with you." Zara looked at him, her expression unreadable. There was a moment of silence before she nodded. "I know you will," she said softly. "We're all in this together now." James felt a rush of determination. It wasn't just about fighting for survival anymore. It was about standing together against an enemy that would stop at nothing to destroy them all. He wasn't alone. He had Zara, the crew of the station, and even the civilians who were doing their best to prepare for what was to come. The next few hours were a blur of activity. The station's defenses were reinforced, and everyone worked together to prepare for the fight ahead. James found himself working alongside soldiers, engineers, and even civilians, all of them with one goal in mind: survival. They weren't just fighting for their homes, they were fighting for their futures. As night fell, the calm before the storm settled over the station. James stood at the main command center, looking out the window at the stars. It was hard to believe that they were just moments away from battle. The thought of facing the Void Collective still filled him with fear, but there was something else there now. Something stronger. Hope. Hope that they could stand together and fight back. Zara stood next to him, her arms crossed as she looked out at the stars as well. She seemed lost in thought, but James could tell that her mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I've faced many battles in my life, but this one feels different. We've never fought for something like this before." James turned to her, his gaze steady. "I think it's because this time, it's about more than just one kingdom or one species. We're all fighting together. We're all in this together." Zara looked at him, and for the first time, there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "You're right," she said. "That's what makes us strong." As the station's alarms blared, signaling that the Void Collective had arrived, the crew and soldiers moved into position. James felt his heart race, but there was no turning back now. He had trained for this moment, and now it was time to act. The first wave of the Void Collective ships appeared on the monitors, dark shapes moving swiftly toward the station. Zara's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Prepare to defend the station! All hands, ready your weapons!" James gripped his blaster tightly and joined the others, ready to do his part. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a soldier, but he was human, and he was ready to fight. The battle began. The alarms blared throughout the station, echoing through the narrow corridors and sending a wave of urgency through the entire crew. The Void Collective was here. The time to fight had come, and there was no turning back. James stood in the command center, his heart racing as the first wave of enemy ships appeared on the screens. Princess Zara, standing at the front of the room, her eyes focused and determined, issued orders without hesitation. "Deploy all defense systems. Station weapons to full power. Prepare for battle." James took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He was ready. Or at least he had to be. This wasn't just a fight for his life. It was a fight for the future of everyone aboard the station. Zara, once a distant figure in his mind, now stood before him as the leader he would fight for. And in turn, she would fight for them all. As the station's shields were activated, the first blasts of energy from the enemy ships shook the walls. The station trembled, but its defenses held strong. Soldiers rushed into position, taking their places at their posts. James stood at the rear, his blaster in hand, ready to assist wherever needed. He wasn't a soldier, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He had trained for this. He had pushed his limits, learned to fight, and prepared for the fight that was now at hand. His role was small compared to the skilled warriors around him, but he knew that every contribution mattered. Every soldier, every mechanic, every civilian, they were all part of this battle. Zara turned to face him as the first shots of the Void Collective's weaponry shook the station. She gave him a brief, approving nod before turning back to the battle at hand. It wasn't just about her leadership anymore, it was about everyone working together, no matter their rank or position. "James, stay alert," she called over her shoulder. "We're not just defending the station, we're defending the galaxy." Her words echoed in his mind as he moved into position. His heart pounded in his chest as he joined a group of soldiers at a weapons station. The station was designed for a crew of experienced soldiers, but James wasn't going to let that stop him. He aimed his blaster at the enemy ships on the screen, doing his part in the defense. The Void Collective's ships were massive, their sleek, dark forms cutting through the stars like shadows. They fired relentlessly at the station, their blasts powerful enough to shake the entire structure. James steadied his aim, remembering the hours he had spent practicing with his weapon. He fired, and the shot hit its target. But it wasn't enough to stop the incoming assault. "Good shot!" one of the soldiers nearby called out. James barely had time to register the compliment before the next blast from the Void Collective rocked the station again. The walls shuddered, and the lights flickered briefly. Zara's voice rang out through the station's comms system. "Stay focused! They're using high-powered weapons. We need to take out their main cannons, aim for their engines, destroy them." The command was clear, but the reality of the situation was anything but easy. The Void Collective was strong. Their technology was far beyond anything humans or their allies had. But there was one thing they didn't count on: the strength of the people who refused to give up. James felt a surge of adrenaline as he aimed his blaster again, firing at the massive enemy ships. He wasn't the best shot, but every hit counted. Every blast he fired helped slow the enemy down, and with every shot, he felt more confident. The battle raged on. For hours, the station's defenses held, but the Void Collective's ships were relentless. The constant barrage of energy blasts from the enemy ships began to take its toll. The station's shields flickered, and small fires broke out in various parts of the station. James didn't stop. He kept fighting, his hands growing sore from the constant firing, but he didn't let up. Then, as the Void Collective's ships began to regroup for a final assault, Zara issued a bold command. "All units, prepare for the final push. We're taking the fight to them." James's heart raced as he followed Zara's orders. The station's weapons fired one last time, and in that instant, something clicked. It wasn't just about fighting back anymore. It was about taking control. They were no longer defending. They were fighting for the future. Zara led the charge, her own ship equipped with the most advanced weapons available. James watched as she took command, leading a small group of ships toward the Void Collective's massive fleet. She was fearless, and that fearlessness spread to the others. For the first time, James saw the strength of the people who had gathered here, fighting for something they all believed in. The final confrontation was brutal. The Void Collective's ships fired back with everything they had, but Zara's fleet held strong. James's ship, though small, followed close behind, joining the fight with everything they had. The battle seemed endless, but with each passing moment, they gained ground. The station's main weapons were powered up for the final strike. James's heart pounded as he helped coordinate the attack, firing at the enemy's weakened defenses. He could feel the energy surge through the ship as they prepared to strike. With a final blast, the Void Collective's flagship exploded, sending shockwaves through the space around them. The remaining enemy ships scattered, retreating into the darkness of space. The battle was won. As the dust settled, the station crew cheered. They had done it. They had fought back and held their ground. James stood, his hands shaking with exhaustion, but a feeling of pride filled his chest. He had done it. He had helped save them. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was part of something much greater. Zara walked up to him, her face worn but triumphant. "You did well," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You proved that even the most ordinary among us can make a difference." James looked at her, a smile spreading across his face. We all did. Together. The battle was over, but the cost was clear. The station was battered, the damage visible in every corner, from broken walls to scorched floors. The once pristine halls were now filled with the scent of smoke and the hum of repair drones working tirelessly. But despite the destruction, there was a sense of triumph in the air. The Void Collective had been driven back, their fleet shattered, and their forces retreating into the darkness of space. They had won. James stood in the command center, still trying to process everything that had happened. His hands were covered in dirt, his uniform torn, but he felt a strange sense of pride. He wasn't a soldier, and yet he had fought alongside. Warriors, technicians, and leaders, all united in a single purpose. He had done his part, and together they had saved the station. Princess Zara walked into the command center, her expression weary but triumphant. She had been at the front lines, commanding her forces with skill and confidence. The marks of battle were evident on her, but there was no doubt in her eyes. This victory was won for the history books. "You did it," James said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. "We did it." Zara turned toward him, her gaze softening as she looked at him for a moment. There was a pause before she spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "No, James, you did it. Without you, none of this would have been possible." James looked at her, not quite understanding. He had only done what anyone would do in a time of need. But Zara's words weren't just praise. They were a recognition of his growth. In that moment, he understood. He wasn't just the mechanic anymore. He had become someone who mattered, someone who had made a difference. "We all played our part," James replied, shaking his head. "This was a team effort." Zara smiled faintly. "True, but your courage, your willingness to fight when it mattered most, inspired everyone here. You showed us all that even the most ordinary person can make the biggest difference." James didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being praised, especially by someone like Zara, but her words meant more than he could express. He had always thought of himself as nothing special, someone just going through life, fixing ships, and keeping things running. But in that moment, he realized that it wasn't the title or the role that mattered. It was the heart, the willingness to stand up for what was right, and the courage to fight when the stakes were highest. As the hours passed, the station slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. The soldiers, engineers, and civilians worked together, clearing the debris, making repairs, and tending to the wounded. The medical bays were busy, but the worst of the fighting was over. The Void Collective had been pushed back, and for now they had won. James helped where he could, offering his skills to repair the damaged equipment and providing support to those who needed it. It was a far cry from the mechanic he had once been, but he had grown into a new version of himself. He was no longer just a man who fixed things. He was someone who fought for a future, who stood up for others when it mattered. The sound of footsteps drew his attention, and he turned to see Zara approaching once again. This time, her expression was more relaxed, the weight of the battle still present but tempered by the relief of victory. She walked up to him, a serious look on her face. "I need you to come with me," she said, her tone commanding but gentle. "There's someone you should meet." James nodded, following her through the station's hallways. They arrived at a secure meeting room where several high-ranking officers were gathered, including the captain of the station. They all looked up as Zara and James entered, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and admiration. "This is James," Zara announced. "The man who helped turn the tide of the battle, the one who proved that humanity has more strength than anyone could have imagined." The officers exchanged glances, clearly surprised. James wasn't a leader or a general. He wasn't even a soldier. But as Zara's words sank in, the admiration in the room became apparent. They recognized the courage it took for someone like James to step up, to fight when everyone else was ready to give up. "We've decided," the captain said, standing and extending a hand to James. "You've earned our respect, and you've earned something more. We'd like to offer you a position as an official member of our defense team. You've proven yourself in battle. We need more people like you." James blinked, unsure of what to say. A part of him wanted to refuse, to go back to his simple life as a mechanic. But another part of him, the part that had fought and stood, tall when the galaxy needed him most, knew that this was his moment. This was the opportunity to make a difference, to be a part of something bigger than himself. I don't know what to say, James said, his voice quiet. I've never been a soldier. I'm just a mechanic. Zara stepped forward, her gaze steady. No, James, you're more than that. You're a hero, and heroes don't have to be soldiers to make a difference. The captain nodded in agreement. We need people like you. People who know how to think under pressure, who know what it means to stand up for something bigger than themselves. We need you. James looked around at the officers, at Zara, and at the crew who had fought beside him. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a part of something greater. And he wasn't going to stop now. I accept, James said, his voice filled with conviction. I'll fight. I'll do whatever it takes. Zara smiled. I knew you would. As James stood there, surrounded by those who had once seen him as just another ordinary man, he realized that the battle was only the beginning. Together, they had fought for their survival, and together, they would fight for the future.